Imagine standing before 10,000 men who have spent the last decade killing for you, only to realize that now they want to kill you. They are not an unruly mob of peasants or a disorganized gang of rebels. They are the 10th Legion, the Equestris, the iron fist of Julius Caesar, the finest killing machine the ancient world has ever seen. These men have crossed the Rubicon, braved the winters of Gaul, and shattered the lines of Pompey the Great. They are exhausted, they are scarred, and they are finished with being told to wait. This is not just a protest, it is a mutiny that threatens to erase everything Caesar has built, turning the master of the Roman world into a ghost before he can even claim his crown. The year is 47 BC, and the Roman Republic is dying a slow, agonizing death. While Caesar had been busy in Egypt, entangling himself in the dynastic struggles of Cleopatra and surviving the harrowing siege of Alexandria, his heartland was rotting. In Italy, the very men who had handed him the keys to the world were beginning to turn. These veterans were no longer the idealistic boys who had marched out of Rome years ago. They were hardened professionals who viewed war as a contract. They had been promised gold, land, and a peaceful retirement. Instead, they were being told to sharpen their swords for yet another campaign, this time in North Africa against the remnants of the Republican Senate. The tension in Rome had reached a breaking point. The soldiers had abandoned their posts in Campania and marched toward the city, an act that was essentially a declaration of war against the government. Along the way, they had plundered estates and ignored the frantic pleas of their officers. To the average citizen of Rome, the sight of the 10th Legion approaching the walls was a nightmare made manifest. These were the men who knew every weakness of the city's defenses. If they decided to sack Rome, there was no force on earth that could stop them. Caesar's second in command, the impulsive and often hedonistic Mark Antony, had already tried to quell the unrest. He was a man of the camps, a soldier's soldier who drank with the ranks and shared their crude humor. But even Antony found himself powerless against the cold, calculated fury of the 10th. They didn't want a drinking buddy, they wanted their back pay. They didn't want a speech about loyalty, they wanted the deeds to the farms they had been promised 5 years prior. Antony's failure was total. He retreated behind the safety of the city walls, leaving the mutineers to simmer in the Campus Martius, the great field of Mars just outside the sacred boundary of the city. When Caesar finally arrived back in Italy, he was greeted not with the traditional garlands of a conqueror, but with a list of demands and the news that his finest troops were on the verge of total rebellion. His advisors were paralyzed by fear. They urged him to stay away from the Campus Martius, fearing that his presence would be the spark that ignited a massacre. They suggested sending more emissaries, perhaps offering a fraction of the gold now to buy time. They told him that the men were in a murderous state of mind, and that even the name of Caesar no longer carried the weight it once did. But Caesar knew something his advisors did not. He knew that power is not just about the sword, it is about the story you tell with it. He rejected the guards, he rejected the intermediaries, he decided that he would face the 10th Legion alone. As he walked toward the Campus Martius, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and the metallic tang of oiled armor. He could hear the low, rhythmic chanting of the men, a sound like a distant thunderstorm rolling over the hills. He climbed the speaker's platform, the rostra, and looked out over a sea of hostile faces. Thousands of swords remained in their sheaths, but thousands of calloused hands were resting on hilts, waiting for the master speaker. The silence that followed Caesar's ascent was not the silence of respect, it was the silence of a held breath before a strike. The 10th Legion, the men who had been his right hand from the forests of Gaul to the plains of Pharsalus, looked at him not as their commander, but as a debtor who had failed to pay. They were tired. Their leather armor was cracked, their tunics stained with the dust of a dozen provinces, and their hearts hardened by broken promises. Caesar stood, his white toga draped with calculated precision, contrasting sharply against the iron and bronze of the gathered mass. He reached for no weapon. He did not signal his bodyguards, who stood at a distance, their faces pale with the realization that they could do nothing if the mob surged forward. To the soldiers, he looked fragile, a lone man of politics standing before an ocean of violence. Then the shouting began. It started from the back, a low growl that rippled through the ranks until it became a deafening roar. They didn't shout for glory, they shouted for discharge. They demanded the rewards they had been promised, the land, the silver, the rest that had been deferred by campaign after campaign. They expected Caesar to plead. They expected him to bring out the ledgers and explain the state of the treasury, to offer excuses about the war in Africa. They wanted him to be small, so they could feel large in their grievances. The sound was a physical wall, a rhythmic demand that shook the wooden boards of the platform beneath Caesar's feet. But Caesar remained a statue of marble. He watched them with an expression of profound, almost fatherly disappointment. As the cries grew louder, a few centurions stepped forward, their voices cracking with the strain of years. These were men who had crossed the Rubicon with him, men who had eaten horseflesh when the grain ran out. They listed their scars. They spoke of the cold nights in the Alps and the scorching sun of Egypt. They were the backbone of the Republic, and they were breaking. The tension was a physical weight, a pressure vibrating in the stones of the rostra. The smell of wood smoke from the nearby camps mingled with the scent of thousands of unwashed bodies, creating an atmosphere that was suffocating. Yet Caesar's silence was his weapon. He knew that the more they screamed, the more they exhausted their rage. He waited for the crescendo to pass, for the collective energy of the mutiny to falter under the weight of his unmoving gaze. Slowly, the roar subsided into a murmur, and then back into that heavy silence. The men shifted their weight, suddenly conscious of the dirt on their hands and the illegality of their posture. They had expected a debate. They were met with a mirror. They looked at the man they had followed to the ends of the earth, and for the first time, they felt the old habit of obedience tugging at them. Caesar finally moved. He simply adjusted the fold of his toga over his shoulder, a mundane gesture that seemed absurdly out of place in a military uprising. It was a reminder that he was a magistrate of Rome, the embodiment of the law they were flouting. When he finally opened his mouth, his voice was not the booming command of a general. It was calm, clear, and carried to the furthest rows by the absolute stillness of the men. "What is it you desire?" he asked. The question was simple, almost dismissive. The leaders of the mutiny, caught off guard, stammered their reply. They repeated their demand for discharge. They believed this was their leverage. If they left, Caesar's upcoming campaign would collapse. He would be left without his veterans, facing a senatorial army with nothing but raw recruits. They thought they had him cornered. They waited for him to beg them to stay. They waited for the general to call them fellow soldiers. Instead, he nodded. He looked out over the faces of the men who had bled for him. He no longer saw them as his loyal fighting men.
He saw them as something else entirely, a gathering of disgruntled civilians. The silence stretched, becoming a physical weight that pressed down on the dusty ground of the Campus Martius. The veterans, who had faced the howling tribes of Gaul and the disciplined lines of Pompey's legions without flinching, now found themselves shifting their feet, looking at the ground, unsettled by the lack of fire in their commander's eyes. They had come for a confrontation. Caesar had brought them a mirror. "I discharge you," Caesar said. His voice was steady, devoid of the passion that usually electrified his speeches. It was the voice of a man settling a minor clerical error. He did not beg. He did not offer excuses about the state of the treasury or the urgency of the African campaign. He simply granted their request. "You are released from your service. You are free to return to your homes and your families." The words should have been a victory for the mutineers. They had achieved exactly what they had marched on Rome to demand. But in the vacuum of Caesar's indifference, the victory felt hollow. The leverage they thought they held, the threat of their absence, had been neutralized by his immediate acceptance. By saying yes, he had taken away their power to say no. But he was not finished. He looked at the mass of men, his gaze lingering on the veterans of the 10th, the legion that had always been his favorite, the men he had called his friends and comrades for over a decade. He spoke again, his voice echoing off the surrounding temples. "And I shall pay you all that I have promised," he continued. "Every denarius of the bounties, every acre of the land. I will fulfill my obligations to you when I celebrate my triumph with other soldiers." The implication hit them like a physical blow. Caesar was going to win without them. He was going to lead a new army, perhaps composed of the very recruits they had mocked, and he was going to march through the streets of Rome in glory. They, the men who had bled to build that glory, would be standing on the sidelines, watching from the crowd like any other common shopkeeper or day laborer. They would receive their money, yes, but they would be excluded from the brotherhood of the victors. Then he delivered the word. It was a single word, chosen with the precision of a master rhetorician who understood the deepest recesses of the Roman psyche. It was not an insult in the traditional sense. It was not a curse or a condemnation. It was a legal definition. Quirites, he called them. In the modern tongue, we translate this simply as citizens. To us, it sounds like a term of respect, perhaps even a title of honor in a republic. But to a Roman legionary, it was a devastating demotion. For years, Caesar had addressed his men as commilitonus, meaning fellow soldiers. That one word, commilitonus, had bridged the gap between the aristocrat and the peasant. It had made them part of something greater than themselves. It was the bond of the camp, the shared oath of the eagle, the sacred connection between a general and his men. By calling them Quirites, Caesar had instantly severed that bond. He had stripped them of their military identity and cast them back into the ranks of the civilian populace. He was no longer their general. He was merely a magistrate, and they were merely citizens. They were no longer the elite warriors of the Roman world. They were just men who lived in a city. The effect was instantaneous and profound. A collective gasp seemed to ripple through the assembly. The anger that had fueled the mutiny for weeks vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp sense of loss. They had wanted their discharge, but they had not wanted to be discarded. They had wanted their pay, but they had not realized that the price of that pay was the loss of their status as Caesar's men. The power dynamic of the Campus Martius shifted instantly. The mutineers were now commoners who stood in silence.
The silence hung over the Campus Martius like a suffocating shroud. Julius Caesar remained on the tribunal, his face a mask of calm, professional indifference. By using that single word, he had performed a feat of linguistic alchemy, turning gold into lead. The veteran soldiers of the 10th Legion, men who had crossed the Rubicon and broken the back of the Republic at Pharsalus, stood frozen. They were no longer the vanguard of an empire. They were a crowd of civilians waiting for their severance pay. To the modern ear, being called a citizen sounds like an elevation. In the democratic tradition, it is the highest office. But in the context of the Roman military machine, it was a demotion to the state of nothingness. A soldier was a man of action, a man of the camp, a man who shared in the imperium of his commander. A Quirites was a man of the law, a man of the forum, a man who lived under the protection of others. By addressing them as Quirites, Caesar had effectively told them, "You are no longer mine. You are now the responsibility of the Roman bureaucracy." The psychological genius of this move lay in its surgical precision. Caesar did not scream. He did not threaten them with decimation or execution. He simply gave them exactly what they had asked for. They had demanded a discharge, he had granted it. They had demanded their rewards, he would provide them. But in doing so, he had stripped them of the one thing they valued more than gold, their pride. They had spent years defining themselves by their relationship to this man. They were the men of Caesar. Without him, they were just aging veterans with aching joints and no purpose. One by one, the soldiers began to look at each other. The banners of the legions, the golden eagles that they had guarded with their lives, suddenly looked like hollow relics. If they were mere citizens, they had no right to stand under those eagles. They had no right to the camaraderie of the mess fire or the shared language of the march. Caesar began to speak again, his voice carried clearly across the still air. He spoke of the land he would distribute to them once he had finished the war in Africa. He spoke of the money he owed them, which he would pay out of the spoils of his upcoming victory. But he spoke of these things as a man speaks to a contractor who has finished a job. He used the third person when referring to the soldiers who would accompany him to Africa, contrasting them with the citizens standing before him. He was already moving on. In his mind and in his words, they were already gone. He was painting a picture of a future where he achieved ultimate glory with a new army, while they sat in quiet obscurity on small plots of land, forgotten by history. The realization hit the ranks like a physical blow. The prospect of the African campaign, which they had previously used as leverage to demand more pay, suddenly became the most desirable thing in the world. They did not want the land in Italy. They wanted to be on those ships. They did not want the coins. They wanted the right to plead for the man on the platform. The anger that had nearly led them to sack Rome only hours before had completely evaporated, replaced by a desperate, clawing need for reconciliation. A low murmur began to rise from the front ranks. It was not a roar of defiance this time, but a plea. Men who had survived the forests of Gaul and the deserts of the East found themselves with tears in their eyes. They began to shout, not for money, but for a title. "We are soldiers," someone cried out. "We are your men." The cry was taken up by others, spreading through the mass of tens of thousands like a wildfire. They begged him to take back the word. They begged him to call them fellow soldiers once again. They were willing to forfeit everything just for soldierly honor.
Caesar did not immediately respond. He allowed the silence to stretch, a silence that felt heavier than the weight of 1,000 iron shields. For a man who had mastered the art of the swift strike and the lightning-fast maneuver on the battlefield, this was his most calculated delay. He watched the veterans, these hardened killers who had conquered the wild forests of Gaul and crossed the forbidden Rubicon, as they finally broke. They were not just asking for their jobs back, they were pleading for their very identity. In the Roman worldview, to be a soldier was to be part of a sacred brotherhood, a cog and a machine of divine destiny. To be a Quirites, a mere civilian, was to be cast out into the mundane world of taxes, trades, and trivialities. It was for them a demotion of the soul. The shouts from the crowd grew more specific and increasingly desperate. "Decimate us," some cried from the middle ranks. This was perhaps the most chilling testament to Caesar's psychological victory. Decimation was the most brutal punishment in the Roman military code, an archaic ritual where every 10th man was chosen by lot to be beaten to death by his own comrades. These men were so desperate to regain their standing as soldiers that they were willing to gamble their lives for the chance to be punished as soldiers rather than dismissed as civilians. They offered up the heads of the primary instigators, the very men who had stood on this same field hours earlier demanding Caesar's own head. The mutiny had not just been quelled, it had been completely inverted. Caesar finally moved, but it was not to embrace them or offer the warmth they craved. Instead, he turned his back. He made as if to descend the stone steps of the speaker's platform, signaling that the conversation was over and the dismissal was final. This movement triggered a wave of panic that history rarely records in such a concentrated mass of humanity. Thousands of men surged forward, not to attack the man they had just threatened, but to block his path. They fell to their knees, clutching at the hem of his purple-bordered robe, sobbing openly. They were no longer the most terrifying force of nature in the Mediterranean. They were children begging a stern father for a scrap of forgiveness. The brilliance of Caesar's gamble lay in his profound understanding of the veteran's ego. He knew that after a decade of continuous war, these men had no home other than the camp. They had no family other than their centurions and their tentmates. By calling them Quirites, he had effectively told them they were homeless. He had told them that the grand story of the Roman Republic would continue, but that their specific chapter had been closed and the ink had already dried. He was moving on to the final act of the Civil War, and he was leaving them behind to grow old in the quiet obscurity of Italian farms. The sun began to dip lower, casting long, distorted shadows across the field of Mars. The air was thick with the dust kicked up by thousands of shifting feet and the heavy, humid scent of men who had spent days in a state of high-tension rebellion. Caesar paused at the very edge of the platform. He looked down at the men nearest to him, men he had known by name for years, men whose wounds he had personally inspected in the freezing mud of Alesia. He saw the genuine agony in their eyes, a pain far sharper than any Gallic blade could ever inflict. He slowly turned back toward the center of the mass. He raised a hand, and the noise died instantly. The silence was absolute. He did not smile. Instead, he spoke with a cold, clinical precision. "I will take you to Africa," he said, his voice carrying to the furthest edges of the silent throng. A collective gasp of relief shuddered through the crowd, but he was not finished. He looked at the 10th Legion and added one thing: "I shall take you, my dear Quirites." The word Quirites hung in the stagnant air, vibrating with a frequency that seemed to shatter the very foundations of the soldier identity. The mutiny, built on entitlement and exhaustion, crumbled into dust. To others, the term was a mark of status, a title signifying personal rights as a free person of the Roman Republic. But in the specialized lexicon of the Roman military, it was a verbal execution. By addressing them as citizens, Caesar had effectively discharged them. He had severed the umbilical cord of the military oath, the sacramentum that bound them to him and to each other. They were no longer his brothers in arms. They were merely civilians, onlookers to a history they had once hoped to write with their own blood. The silence that followed was not the respectful hush of an audience, but the stunned, suffocating quiet of a funeral. A ripple of movement began at the front of the formation, where the veterans of the 10th stood. These were men who had crossed the Rhine, who had climbed the walls of Gergovia, and who had stood like iron pillars at Pharsalus. They were men whose skin was a map of his campaigns, scarred and weathered by a decade of unrelenting service. To be called citizens by the man they had deified was a blow sharper than any spear thrust. It was an expulsion from the only family they truly knew. One by one, the centurions, those hardened, brutal men who governed the heartbeat of the legions, began to falter. Their swords, once held with defiant grip, dipped toward the earth. The collective ego of the 10th, the 9th, and the 11th collapsed inward. The anger that had fueled their march on Rome, the demands for pay, the complaints about the African heat, all of it evaporated, replaced by a desperate, clawing need for reconciliation. They did not want their discharge. They did not want the quiet life of a farmer in a sun-drenched colony if it meant Caesar looked at them and saw only silent strangers. Caesar, for his part, did not offer them the dignity of a lingering gaze. He turned his shoulder,
his heavy wool toga rustling with a sound like dry leaves, and began to step away from the edge of the rostrum. This was his most calculated move. Had he stayed to argue, he would have remained on their level, a negotiator among equals. By walking away, he re-established the unsurmountable distance between a commander and his subjects. He was leaving them behind. He was going to Africa to claim his own final total victory, and he was absolutely going to do it without them. A low moan began to rise from the ranks, a sound that started in the throats of the youngest recruits and quickly infected the grizzled veterans. It was the sound of thousands of men begging for their chains. "No, Caesar!" someone cried out from the middle of the throng, the voice cracking with genuine grief. "We are your soldiers! Call us soldiers!" The cry was taken up by others, a discordant chorus of pleas that washed over the field of Mars. Men hours ago threatened to burn the city, now threw themselves into the dust, reaching out toward the platform as if they could physically pull back the long shadow of their slowly retreating general. He stopped, his back still turned to them. The tension in the air was so thick it felt as though the very light of the setting sun was struggling to penetrate it. Mark Antony and the other officers stood frozen, watching the master of Rome play his greatest gamble. Caesar knew that the soldier identity was not found in his pay chest or his land grant, but in the eyes of his commander. By withdrawing his recognition, he had erased their existence. They were now nothing more than ghosts wandering the outskirts of a republic that no longer required their service. They were mere Quirites, and in that terrible realization, the rebellion died an unceremonious death. Caesar had not used a sword to win this specific internal war with his own old legions.
The silence that followed was not the quiet of peace, but the stillness of a vacuum. By addressing them as Quirites, Caesar had forcefully evicted his men from the world of war and relegated them to the world of the home. He had stripped them of their military identity without ever touching a buckle. The cry that eventually rose from the masses was not one of anger, but of a profound collective heartbreak. It began as a low murmur from the front ranks of the 10th Legion. The veterans who had broken the Gallic lines at Alesia and stood firm at Pharsalus did not ask for the gold they had been shouting for just minutes prior. They did not ask for the fertile lands of Campania. They begged for the right to be called his soldiers once more. "We are not citizens," they screamed, their voices cracking under the weight of their desperation. "We are your men. Punish us, decimate us, but do not dismiss us." Caesar remained on the edge of the rostrum, his face a mask of calculated indifference. He knew that to yield too soon would be a sign of weakness. To wait too long would allow the desperation to turn back into a different kind of rage. He watched as veteran centurions, men whose bodies were maps of scars earned in the name of his glory, wept openly. They offered their necks to his lictors, inviting the axis to do what his words had already accomplished. They were willing to die as soldiers rather than live as mere civilians. Mark Antony, standing just behind Caesar, likely marveled at this mastery. This was the manipulation of identity itself. Caesar finally began to speak again, his voice carrying that high-pitched, piercing quality that always cut through the wind. He did not grant their request immediately. Instead, he spoke to them as if he were already making arrangements for their civilian lives. He promised them that, as citizens, they would still receive the money and land he had promised. But he added with a chilling finality, they would not share in the glory of his upcoming triumph. They would watch from the sidelines as spectators while he celebrated the victories they had helped them win. This was the final devastating blow. In the Roman world, the triumph was the ultimate validation. To be excluded from the procession, to be denied the right to march behind their general as he ascended the Capitoline Hill, was to be erased from history. The soldiers could endure the cold of the Alps and the hunger of a siege, but they could not endure being forgotten. They could not bear the thought of standing in the crowd, wearing civilian tunics, while their replacements wore the laurel wreaths of victory. The mutiny dissolved into a frantic plea for reconciliation. The men swore they would follow him anywhere, to the scorched deserts of Africa, to the ends of the known world, without another word about pay or delay. They were his tools again, sharpened by the whetstone of their own shame. Caesar, sensing the moment was ripe, allowed his expression to soften. He didn't offer a warm embrace, but a cold, calculated reprieve. He agreed to take them back, but he made it clear. The 10th Legion would be punished with reduced rewards. The crisis was over, but the atmosphere on the field of Mars had changed. The soldiers were no longer the arrogant conquerors who had marched into the city with demands. They were a humbled force, eager to prove their worthiness to the man who had so easily cast them aside. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the gears of the Roman war machine began to turn once more. The target was Africa, where the remnants of the Pompeian faction were gathering strength. Caesar had his army back, but he had something far more potent. He had their absolute, terrified loyalty.
The march to the sea began that night, the rhythmic thud of thousands of sandals creating a heavy heartbeat for the old, dying republic that Caesar was now destined to forever reshape into a mirror reflecting his own dark, singular imperial ambition.
The dust of the field of Mars had barely settled before the first cohorts reached the coast of Sicily, the staging ground for the invasion of Africa. There was a peculiar, heavy silence that hung over the 10th Legion during that march. Usually, a Roman legion on the move was a cacophony of rhythmic chanting, the clatter of gear, and the coarse jests of veterans who had seen everything. But now, the veterans of the 10th moved like ghosts. They were men who had been looked in the eye by their commander and found wanting. Every mile covered toward the sea was a silent plea for penance. Caesar, traveling in his litter or riding slightly ahead, did not acknowledge their renewed zeal. He treated them with the professional coldness one might show a rusted tool that had been sharpened but not yet trusted. He had stripped them of the title soldiers, and until they bled for him again, they remained merely citizens in his ledgers. The African campaign would provide the blood they so desperately sought to offer. At the Battle of Thapsus, the desperation of the 10th Legion turned into a terrifying, uncontrollable fury. When the lines finally met, Caesar did not even have to give the formal order to charge. The men of the 10th, fearing that any delay would be interpreted as another sign of hesitation, surged forward with a ferocity that stunned even Caesar's most seasoned officers. They were not fighting for the glory of Rome, nor for the promise of gold, nor for the expansion of the borders. They were fighting to reclaim a single word. They were fighting to be called commilitones, fellow soldiers once again. They slaughtered the Pompeian forces with a systematic ruthlessness that bordered on the psychiac, refusing to give quarter even when Caesar himself attempted to signal restraint. By the time the sun set over the African sands, the Republican cause was shattered. Scipio was defeated. Cato the Younger would soon take his own life in Utica, refusing to live in a world governed by Caesar's mercy. When Caesar finally addressed the 10th after the carnage of Thapsus, he finally used the word they craved. He called them his soldiers. He promised them their lands and their triumphs. But the relationship had been fundamentally altered. The mutiny and its resolution had exposed the terrifying truth of the late Republic. The legions did not belong to the Senate, nor to the people of Rome. They belonged to the man who could master their psyche. The word Quirites had been a masterstroke of psychological warfare, but it was also a funeral dirge for the old ways. It proved that the Roman soldier's identity was now entirely dependent on the commander's recognition. Without Caesar's approval, they were nothing more than a mob of civilians lost in the machinery of state. This moment on the field of Mars was the true beginning of the imperial age. While the formal transition to empire is often dated to Augustus, the psychological foundation was poured by Julius Caesar on that afternoon when he refused to beg. He had looked at the most powerful military force on earth and told them they were irrelevant. In doing so, he became their everything. The Republic was a collection of laws and traditions, but Caesar was a living, breathing reality who could grant or withhold the very essence of a man's pride. As the legions eventually returned to Rome for the most lavish triumphs the city had ever seen, the citizens cheered for a conqueror who had conquered his own men before he conquered the world. The mutiny was a forgotten footnote to the public, but for the men of the 10th, the sting of being called citizens remained a ghost in their memories. It was the word that broke their will, and in doing so, forged the Iron Crown of the Caesars. The old world was gone, replaced by a singular ambition that would echo through history, long after the last legionary had finally turned to dust. This was the final victory of a man who understood that words, when chosen with lethal precision, are always more powerful than swords.